Oh, was that too soon? Good morning, everyone. Good evening and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am delighted to have with me today Dr. Peter Hotez, vaccine scientist, advocate for global health vaccines and tropical disease control. He wears many hats, has been in his time U.S. science envoy to the Middle East and Africa under the Obama administration, currently Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. And of course, the author of many books, which we will come to. But Dr. Hotez, today we'd really like to talk about your new COVID vaccine. Tell us a little bit about Corbavax. It's a recombinant protein vaccine, which for those among us who are not vaccinologists, essentially means that it's not an mRNA vaccine, of which we have heard so much. What does that mean in terms of the use of the vaccine today? In some sense, are you a bit late to this because we are now obviously dealing with Omicron, which is much harder to deal with these more traditional technologies?
Well, you're right. This is a traditional technology vaccine. It's the similar technology used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that's been used for 4 decades, even given to infants. So it's got a tremendous safety profile. And it's actually a vegan vaccine. It's done through recombinant protein fermentation in yeast, a yeast known as Pichia pastoris. And the reason why that's relevant is because that technology has been around for years and is in place in many low and middle income countries so that they can make their own hepatitis B vaccine and therefore can make our vaccine. So when I say we, I'm referring to the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development, which is based also at Baylor College of Medicine. It's co-headed by myself and my science partner for the last 20 years, Dr. Mary Elena Bottazzi, and we've been making for 2 decades parasitic disease vaccines for the poor, vaccines for diseases such as Chagas disease and schistosomiasis, neglected infections of poverty. But we've also, about 10 years ago, started developing coronavirus vaccines using those same low-cost approaches and methods. And then when the COVID-19 sequence came along, we developed the COVID-19 sequence. And the irony is, because all we know how to do is make low-cost, straightforward technologies for people who live in poverty and resource-poor settings, that's all we know how to do. And so we did that for the COVID-19 vaccine. And now we've developed it and licensed it, and we help in the co-development to 4 countries: India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Botswana, where they all have differing capacities for developing recombinant protein vaccines. And the one most advanced is Biological E, based in Hyderabad. They're an outstanding company that are making vaccines for global use for many years. And we've licensed it, helping the co-development. They have 150 million doses ready to go and have the capacity to produce 1 billion doses this year. And so this is a very exciting partnership. No patents, no strings attached, simply to get people vaccinated as quickly and as efficiently as possible with a high quality vaccine that looks like it could protect about as well as mRNA vaccines, maybe even greater durability of protection as well, with a fantastic safety profile at a cost maybe around $2 a dose. So the least expensive vaccine, simple refrigeration. So when you go down the checklist, this looks like a pretty good vaccine for global health. And we hope this will make a fundamental contribution to vaccinate the world.
Certainly your approach is one that we would like to see replicated, but does it work against the variants that we have seen, a more infectious variant like Omicron?
Well, in the lab, it works as well as any vaccine against Delta and Beta, which are 2 variants of concern. We're not on a priority list for getting the Omicron pseudovirus and the virus isolate. So that's coming, and we'll hopefully have that data soon. But based on how it's performing against Delta and Beta, we have some reasonable expectation that it should hold up pretty well against Omicron as well.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. I would love to ask you about, obviously, the issue that underlines the vaccine that you have developed, which is the fact that most of the world is not getting the vaccine. You have worked for a long time on vaccine diplomacy, long before COVID-19 was a thing. It hasn't worked this time. We have not seen the sort of vaccine diplomacy that we saw in the Sabin, even when Sabin was working with the Soviet Union. Why is it? Why have we failed this time?
Well, in fact, we've seen two very ominous trends. The first one is the exclusive reliance on the multinational pharma companies, and not that the multinational pharma companies are bad bad guys, right? They're not. I mean, let's face it. Through when you look at the Gavi alliance pre-pandemic, the big pharma companies have supplied quite a number of those vaccines. So the problem was the way the incentivizing structure worked through Operation Warp Speed and through the G7 countries. It was all about speed and innovation and rapid immunizations of smaller populations. And they wound up making pretty interesting vaccines. And look, I myself got the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, and I'm grateful it may have saved my life. But when you do that model, it should have been expected that those vaccines were not going to filter to low and middle income countries, because when you can't scale them at that level, you need 9 billion doses for the world's LMICs, 1 billion people in Africa, 1 billion people in Latin America and the Caribbean, 1 billion people in the smaller low income countries of Southeast Asia. Multiply it times 3, that's 9 billion doses. You take any new technology, as any engineer will tell you, you can't go from 0 to 9 billion, but you can with ours because it's been around for so long and in place locally. So I think that was a terrible policy failure. And then you had the fact that you had countries like China and Russia making vaccines that are not holding up well against the variant, certainly in the case of the whole inactivated virus vaccines out of China, but conducted their business in a very transactional way that initially bypassed the World Health Organizations. It was one-on-one bilateral arrangements with countries, often in exchange of who knows what, whether it was in terms of in return, and that was damaging. And so, we came along, and I said to Mary Elena, my science partner, look, when your house is on fire, you can make one phone call. Who do you call? Well, you don't call a patent attorney, you call the fire department. And so we're the fire department that's come in to help fix this problem in collaboration with some outstanding partners.
In your book, Preventing the Pandemic, you get to some of these issues, talk about your own experiences in vaccine diplomacy, but you also talk about the importance of new vaccine technologies and surveillance. Could that be a new phase of vaccine diplomacy? I mean, do we have an opportunity there to right some of the wrongs?
Well, I think so. I think not only are we transferring the technology, but we help build vaccine development capacity. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the vaccine ecosystem. It's not as simple as building a factory. I mean, you could build an mRNA factory tomorrow, but it's the human capital, knowing how to make vaccines at scale. Vaccines are a different ecosystem from small molecule drugs or diagnostics. It takes years to build the human capital, know how to do this under a quality umbrella with quality assurance, quality control, how to work with national regulatory authorities. And that's what takes the time. And that's one of the things we do. As I like to say, you can't walk into Merck or GSK and say, show me how to make a vaccine, but you can walk into our facility and we'll teach you. So we do a lot of capacity building. And we started this, we've been doing this for years. It took it to a new level when I served as U.S. Science Envoy for vaccine diplomacy in the Obama administration, and continuing along those lines now for our COVID vaccines.
Do you think we're doing enough when it comes to surveillance? Because that will be the next phase of this. We'll be preparing, truly preparing for the next pandemic. We'll be finding it.
Well, we're not even ready for the next variant. And there's all this happy talk now in the U.S. that somehow Omicron represents some kind of weird form of attenuated vaccine. It's going to give everyone herd immunity, and that's how this is going to end, which is utter nonsense, right? Because the Omicron variant will probably behave more like upper respiratory coronaviruses in terms of immune response, not very durable protection at all. And so we're going to be vulnerable again. And because we've refused as a society to vaccinate the world's low and middle income countries, we know what's coming. Starting this summer, we will have another terrible variant of concern that will, like the last 2 summers, will sweep across the southern United States and here in Texas and cause a lot of devastation. I mean, Mother Nature's not being coy. She's told us what she's going to do. She gave us Delta out of an unvaccinated population in India in the beginning of 2021. She gave us Omicron out of an unvaccinated population in Southern Africa in towards the end of last year. And guess what? She's going to do it again. And I just can't tell you whether it's going to be Africa or Laos or somewhere else in Southeast Asia or Paraguay, but that's what's going to happen until we resolve that we're not going to do this anymore and we're going to vaccinate the world, and hopefully our vaccine will make a difference.
One of the issues that you touch on there is the anti-science movement, which in your book is also described as one of the big impediments to preparing adequately for the next variant, never mind for the next pandemic. You're sitting at the epicenter of some of that anti-science movement in Texas, and obviously have been very involved personally in dealing with that. What could we be doing more of? So both in terms of dealing with the problems we are now, and also sort of inoculating people against some of this anti-science disinformation that is so widely available.
Yeah, we've not, at least in the US, we've not been willing to take on the anti-vaccine movement in a big way. And when, I saw taking a political spin and aligning itself to political extremism on the right, now it's a full-on component of the far right. And you're hearing it from members of the US Congress. I mean, I just had just yesterday, a member of the U.S. Congress start going after me together with Steve Bannon. Talk about how odd that is, and I hear about me on from the Fox News anchors at night who go after me, and I'm not a public figure in the sense I'm a working scientist here and a professor here in Texas, medical school professor. So that is really concerning, and the consequences are devastating. When you add up the numbers since the middle of last year, since the summer of 2021, 250,000 Americans unvaccinated have lost their lives to COVID, despite the widespread availability of vaccines. I don't even know words you use. It's not even misinformation or disinformation. It's a form of self-immolation out of allegiance to political extremism on the right. So anti-science is a killing force. And I've written a paper with the title Anti-Science Kills, and it's killing more Americans than things like nuclear proliferation or cyber attacks or terrorist attacks. This is a far deadlier force, and we've not come to terms with it here in the United States. And now it's starting to globalize. It's globalized to Canada, and now we're seeing it in Western Europe. And I'm very concerned that we are not taking this seriously enough.
What do we need to do, in your view? I mean, you've talked about having scientists more present in public discourse, about removing posts from the internet, and in particular from e-commerce sites where they are quite prevalent. Is that what we need to do, or is there more? Do we need to sort of go down the Adam Grant route and talk to people more, allow them to reach their own conclusions, given the role, as you mentioned, of sort of political and social forces here?
Well, the problem is, the health sector has more or less abdicated any interest in doing something about it. I mean, Health and Human Services in the U.S. government won't take this on. I mean, for years I would get rebuked for bringing this up, and they would say, Peter, we're not talking about this now. It'll give it oxygen, which goes to show you how ridiculous that is, right? It has all the oxygen it needs. So the health sector has basically decided they're not going to deal with it. They can't deal with the fact that it's taken on a political dimension. It's impolite to talk about, so they'd rather let people die. I hate to say that in such blunt terms, but that is the reality. So in the U.S. side, we need to bring in Department of Homeland Security. This is a Homeland Security issue. The Justice Department, the Commerce Department. We've got Putin and his Russia propaganda machine using this as a wedge issue, filling our internet with anti-vaccine messages. We have to bring in State Department and really bring people together who know how to combat these kinds of global forces and get advice on how to manage that. And we need to do this at the international level too. We need to bring in all the UN agencies in order to help us with this problem as well. And as I say, it is as great a killing force as anything.
One of the consequences of this, obviously, is also the return of diseases that we had thought eradicated, and diseases associated with poverty. In your book, not in the one about the pandemic, in previous work that you've done on forgotten diseases, forgotten people, forgotten illnesses, you do talk about some of these. How have they fared in the pandemic, and what are we doing about walking and chewing gum at the same time, dealing with more than one global health problem?
Well, you're right. Most people are learning about me only in this time of COVID, but my 40-year career has been devoted to solving problems for these neglected tropical diseases, or as I call it in the book, forgotten diseases of forgotten people. Diseases like hookworm infection and schistosomiasis and Chagas disease, leishmaniasis. These are poverty-promoting diseases because of the social stigma they cause, especially among girls and women. Female genital schistosomiasis, a disease of 40 million girls and women that no one's ever heard of, yet it's probably one of the major causes of gynecologic problems on the African continent. And they affect worker productivity and child development, pregnancy outcome. These diseases actually trap human populations in poverty. And so we've been designing interventions for these diseases for decades. So it really does a deep dive into what these conditions are and get them on the radar screen, because prior to that, the Millennium Development Goals, for instance, in 2000 talked about AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. And it's hard to do advocacy for something called other diseases. So we labeled them as the neglected tropical diseases, or NTDs. And now people are starting to understand what we're talking about with them.
What do you think about when we talk about the next pandemic? In your view, where does that come from? I mean, is it a climate? So we are seeing more zoonotic diseases as a result of climate change, but also the emergence of some of these illnesses in places where they were not before. So in Southern Europe, for example, in parts of the United States, and not just among poorer populations. Where would you have the world turn its attention?
Well, I think, one of the other aspects of this is the diseases of the poor amidst wealth, and a concept that I call blue marble health. So much of the dialogue around global health is poor versus wealthy countries. Well, the world's not quite that way anymore. At least pre-pandemic, most of the economies are growing, but they're leaving behind a bottom segment of society. And the irony is, when you add up where most of the world's poverty-related diseases are, sure, they're in fragile nation states in Africa and elsewhere, but overwhelmingly, it's the poor living in G20 countries, and as well as Nigeria, which is not a G20 country, but it's got an economy bigger than the bottom 3 or 4 G20 countries. So it's diseases of the poor amidst wealth. And here in the United States as well, we've identified around 12 million Americans living with a poverty-related neglected disease, such as Chagas disease or toxoplasmosis or typhus, and we have dengue here. And so making that awareness that we have to change our paradigms for thinking about that as well.
And the zoonotic part, the climate, because those would be contagious diseases, because the neglected diseases that you're talking
Right.
about are largely.
Well, when you look at whether it's zoonotic or non-zoonotic infectious diseases, they are being buffeted by new forces. So, for instance, for the first time, as of a few years ago, more people live in urban environments than rural environments. So we're seeing a lot of urbanization of infectious diseases, and dealing with megacities, especially, that outstrip their public infrastructure for sewers and high quality water and food safety. That's become a problem. Climate change is a problem. But also, what's interesting about climate change, it doesn't interact as a force on its own. It just interacts with these other social forces, which includes urbanization as well as conflicts. So let me give you just 2 brief examples. In the Middle East, where we've seen the return of measles and polio and cutaneous leishmaniasis accelerating. It's, of course, the previous ISIS occupation when I served as U.S. science envoy, the civil conflict in Yemen, which is a surrogate conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But at the same time, you have unprecedented temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius on the Arabian Peninsula, people abandoning ancient agricultural lands along the Tigris and Euphrates, pouring into cities like Aleppo. That in itself is a destabilizing factor. So the book looks at how all of these social and physical determinants operate in interesting ways to generate disease. Or in Venezuela with the Maduro regime and the socioeconomic collapse in Venezuela, people stopped vaccinating, measles returned. People were desperate for employment, sleeping outdoors without bed nets in the gold mining industry in the rural areas, then crossing over into neighboring areas of the Amazon in Brazil or into Colombia and exposing ancient indigenous populations and decimating those individuals. So looking at these large regions of the world where social and physical determinants are now combining in a very unique and interesting ways.
Dr. Peter Hotez, we wish your vaccine every success for all those reasons that you have just mentioned. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.